Today is Saturday, September 3rd, 2016. I'm Debra Polsky, and I am recording an oral interview, and I'll let Pat introduce herself.
My name is Patricia Titche Harrell. I believe, and it's so interesting that you never ask the right questions until you can't anymore. I definitely was not named for any particular person. My middle name, Ann, is spelled with an E, perhaps because my mom wanted it to be a little special. But I can say with pretty good certainty that Patricia Ann Titche was the name because my mother loved for initials to spell a name. And I was always called Pat, not Patty or anything else, because my initials spelled Pat.
So let me interrupt you just for a sec. Do you have a Hebrew name?
I was just going to say no. I was never bat mitzvahed, and I am unaware of any Hebrew name.
Okay, so tell me what you know about your family, and I know that you know quite a bit on some sides and not so much on the other, but how they got here, where they came from, how they came to America, anything that you know about your family.
I know much less in terms of where my father's family came from. I know that they generally settled in Port Gibson, Mississippi, and moved to Memphis. Not my parents. My father was born in Memphis, Tennessee. My mother's family primarily came from the Alsace-Lorraine region through Baltimore. And I really know much more about my grandmother, Amanda Hexter Levy, than I do know about my grandfather, Henry Titche. I'm trying to think if I even know of a middle name for him. I know my grandmother's family, who were at one point Levi's. Abraham Levi was sort of the progenitor or whatever.
Patriarch.
Thank you, patriarch. We're in Victoria, Texas, where he was in banking and farming, ranching interests. My grandmother and grandfather always lived in Dallas after their marriage, in sort of South Dallas. I used to know the name of the street they lived on, but I can't think of it now. What else?
Probably either Park Row or South Boulevard. Those areas.
That doesn't sound too familiar, but I could potentially find that. My grandfather was, when he certainly started, he had a finance company that also sold used cars, and I don't really know how he became pretty darn successful, but he did. At that same location, my grandmother had a little lending library, one of the first in Dallas. And I know that my grandfather was a founder of the Community Chest in Dallas. Oh. And they were moderately prominent. They belonged to Temple Emmanuel when it had its location prior to the Hillcrest location. That was actually where I attended religious school for a long time. And I think once, I haven't seen these photos in a really long time, but once I can remember there were Purim pictures of us in costume in front of that temple before the building moved to Hillcrest, which is where I was confirmed.
Okay. Were your parents active? Or grandparents active in the temple?
At some point in time, my grandparents were somewhat active. My parents sent my brother and me to religious school, and we were both confirmed. They went to temple on the high holy days only, and as sad as it may be, it's the truth. My mother not only didn't like being asked to pay particular dues rather than being able to donate what she thought was appropriate. But also, she never felt that we could really afford to pay the dues at a level that the temple requested. And certainly once my brother and I were adults, they were not members of the congregation anymore. But I know, I don't believe I ever saw this, but I know for a fact that they read the prayer book on High Holy Days at home.
What do you remember about your childhood there?
Great childhood. I have virtually no bad memories, where my brother and I may differ. No bad memories. My parents had a great, large group of friends. My mother helped in Girl Scouts and maybe at the elementary school, which was within walking distance of our house. I need to back up, actually, because my parents and I lived with my grandparents on Woodland Drive, which was in fact a lovely street at that point, a huge piece of property. My parents and I lived with my grandparents until the birth of my brother, when I was about 6. Then they did buy their first and only house in North Dallas on Mimosa, just a few houses off of Hillcrest. As I said, my grandparents were certainly comfortable, and I do have pictures of this nice, attractive house. My grandparents doted on me. As it turned out, I was not only the first grandchild, I was the only girl of 4 grandchildren. So I was definitely golden and lucky, to say the least.
And what elementary school did you go to?
After my parents moved to their house on Mimosa, I went to Preston Hollow. I was close enough to walk, which pretty much I did much of the time or most of the time. And one of my vivid memories was of a great one of the northwester storms that would come in and the temperature would drop 30 degrees or something. And I guess a real storm was forecast, because I can remember my mother walking to the school and accompanying me home, which was out of the ordinary.
What do you recall about your parents' social life?
Parents had a great social life. They were, when I say never, I not until close to my father's retirement, they were never as prosperous as their social group was. But I also have pictures of this. My father, and I guess my mom too, father was pretty creative. And in the backyard of this large home that my grandparents had, we had huge birthday parties with tables set up, occasionally entertainers, and dozens of family, children, friends would come to these birthday parties. Another thing, sadly, shouldn't say sadly, we always celebrated Christmas. And there were lots of pictures, not only of extravagant trees and presents at Christmas time, but my father, for a number of years, until actually probably my brother was born, would photograph me and presents or something, and make Christmas cards. So there is a series of those. My mother's sister was also very creative, and they used to wrap presents. The one that I really remember was somebody, don't ask me why, somebody needed a new toilet seat, and it was the kind that was split at the front. It wasn't a perfect oval. So they made a cowboy out of that with the toilet seat as he's bow-legged. So they did things like that. Not having a ton of money, they did fun, creative things. I remember one of the fun things we did, and this was after my brother was born, we would chase down searchlights. There would be a searchlight harboring the opening of some kind of business, probably a car lot, but maybe another business as well. And we would spend hours following that light until my parents, found the source of it, which was sort of fun, we thought.
Do you remember any of your friends from that
Absolutely.
age? Are there people you're still friendly with?
Sadly, no. Pretty much everybody moved away. We all went to college in different directions, and I went all the way to the West Coast, and many of them, went another direction. So I am no longer friendly with them, but my group consisted of the Flaxmans. I mean, these are all names. The Aronoffs, Burnett's, Rosenthal, Mittenthal. We were probably the group that really hung together.
And out after Preston Hollow, where did you go to school?
Went to Benjamin Franklin Junior High School, which is directly next to Hillcrest High School, where I went to school.
What was that like?
It was fine. Generally speaking, all of my best Jewish friends did not attend Hillcrest. They went to other schools, Hockaday, as well as I think TJ was. I think there was another high school, Thomas Jefferson High School, that they attended. But we all saw each other and socialized through the temple. High school was great. I was very successful, so I got lots of props and won awards, and I was very fortunate in that.
Were you involved in youth groups or?
I don't think so. I mean, I was involved in the Latin club, God forbid, that I remember, and I know I was a member of the honor. I did well academically, so I was a member of the honor society. And I do remember, because it played a role in my marriage, that I won the Daughters of the American Revolution essay on God knows what the topic was.
You don't remember what the topic was?
Do not remember the topic at all.
And you said you and your friends were involved in the Temple youth group.
Yes.
So, okay, so you made the decision to go to college far, far away. Mm-hmm. From Dallas. Was that intentional? I mean,
how very perceptive of you. Yes, my father would have given anything in the world for me to attend Newcomb, because that would have permitted him to visit his favorite city, New Orleans. But Newcomb at that point was just sort of like high school, one step up, and I was sort of pegged as the brainiac, and I wanted to ditch that persona. So I applied to Pomona. I applied to actually Occidental College in the LA area and Pomona College in Claremont, California, and I was accepted and chose to go to Pomona, where I was at the very bottom of the heap scholastically and intellectually, and that suited me well.
That's great. So what did you major in?
I started out as a math major, and that lasted maybe one semester when I realized I was so outclassed, and switched to that generic major of English literature. And my mother was adamant that if I was going to major in something as not really impractical as English, but that I needed to be able to get a teaching certificate, which this was all, I'd say, very typical for the era. And even though Lee and I got married like a week or so after I graduated, I did go to graduate school and did teach briefly, and I was so unsuited to do that that I was in a college town. The Claremont colleges are there, and there's also a graduate school, so I was able to, but basically, I think I got pregnant so that I was able to quit teaching. So that worked out pretty well. But then after our son Jed was born, I did, for a number of years, and really quite successfully, had a typing and editing service that did academic work in Claremont.
Cool. So what kind of things were you active in college?
In college?
Mm-hmm. Anything?
partying and drinking. I mean, I did well in college, but...
Was there a Jewish connection there at all, or?
Oh, I should tell this story. It's my favorite story. It may not be anyone else's. There wasn't a big Jewish crowd in college, but there must have been a sign-up sheet if we wanted to attend probably Passover services. I don't remember High Holy Days, but there was a sign-up for Passover, and so I put my name on it. And an adult member of the community was going to take me to a Seder dinner. So I put on my one good dress, which I could still describe to you. It was sort of yellow quilted, sleeveless, and it looked great, and I loved it. And when the time came for someone to pick me up, it was a Volkswagen bus, and a husband, a wife, and 3 children were there. So the only place for me to sit was in the back of the bus, and as it turned out, I guess they were doing yard work because I did sit on the bag of manure that was was in the back of the van.
No.
And we went to the home of a local lawyer and her husband who put this on. The family who took me were not Jewish, but they were super, super liberals and were connected sort of with I think the lawyer was active in civil rights, and this man was active in civil rights. And I'm probably going to get this one wrong, a local minister in the community donated the folding chairs, to have at the dinner. And so he was invited, and I do remember that he got a little lit up on the wine. But and the other thing that I remember about this Seder was that in my very best dress, I was asked to clear the tables and scrape everything into the wastebasket, which of course everything splashed all over me. But the hysterical point is that several years later, I re-met the man who transported me that evening, because he and my husband-to-be were the head of the civil rights movement in Claremont, and were that couple are still our friends to this day.
That's a great
It
story.
is, I think, ironic.
So you tell me about meeting your husband.
I was friendly with the same group of about 10 women from my freshman year through my senior year. In fact, my freshman roommate was my roommate every year at college, and there were 10 of us who were really good friends. And by the beginning of my senior year, all of those women were paired up with males except for me. And at some point I got a phone call from Lee, who did become my husband, because he was referred to one of these 10 women. There was a long connection from his prep school. She had gone to boarding school in Switzerland, and he was told to get a hold of her. She was involved with a male. I was the only one in this group who was unattached. And 50 years later, I think I'm the only one who's still married to my original husband. But that was originally how Lee and I met.
Okay. So you get married right out of college.
Yes.
Go to graduate school.
Yes.
You start teaching.
Yes. I stopped teaching.
And you chose to stay in California.
Yes,
did your parents think that
Oh.
you would come back to Dallas afterwards?
I don't know that I can find it, which is a crime if I can't, but certainly during the 60s, everyone had a charm bracelet.
Right.
And I did as well. And one of the charms on that bracelet is a little gold state of Texas with a tiny diamond marking where Dallas is. And on the back of it, it says CBTT, come back to Texas. My mother feared, rightfully, that once I left, I probably wouldn't come back. I was not as iconoclastic as Lee, but I was not as traditional as a lot of people I grew up with. I didn't wear madras all the time, you know, and a lot of things like that. So California suited me better than Texas. Luckily, Lee was getting his graduate degree at the Claremont Graduate School at that point, and teaching at a local college. So we ended up staying there for over 20 years. Most fortunately, my father, having always had a pretty sad, low-paying job at an insurance company, a small independent insurance company in Dallas, that company was purchased by Equitable Life Insurance Company, and they vested him for all of those years he had worked without a pension. And he had this huge pension and took early retirement at about 45 or 47 or something amazing like that. So he and Lee always got along super, super, super well. And my parents would come and spend 6 weeks at a time with us in California twice a year. The children traveled both to my parents and with my parents. We went to Europe with them. The children went to Europe independently with them. All sorts of wonderful things like that. So having had a sort of touch and go childhood and their young adulthood, in later life they were fine, and that was nice.
That's a wonderful story too.
I was happy for them.
That's really lovely. And I'm going to ask you a lot more about your parents certainly in a minute. But I do have one question. I mean, obviously you grew up with the name Titche. Titche Gettinger's was, you know,
that
this
was owned.
massive store. Did people assume that your means were better because there was a connection to that? That's
an interesting question. I don't remember certainly ever talking about that or even really thinking about that. I don't think that there was really any assumption, and I said that my mother was very straightforward and had no airs of any, AIRS of any sort. And so she was very open about how much money they did or did not have. Mm-hmm. So I don't really think so. I remember, you know, these were literally the good old days. I remember one of my fairly good friends was Carrie Marcus, an heir to the Marcuses, right. and that Carrie was a male. And he and I, you know, were sort of buddies. But before that, I remember going to Neiman's. Neiman's had big Christmas displays, and you know, well, to this day they've got that huge Christmas catalog. Right. And at least one year they had a department that was designed for young people to shop in. So I was probably no more than 10, might have been younger, but I remember wearing a cute hat and gloves and going to shop there for presents, for, you know, holiday presents for my family, my parents. So we, one of my good friends was Mary Sanger, of at that point another department store, right. Sanger's department store. And I guess my parents had a good pedigree. So even if they themselves were not very well off, heritage mattered at that point.
Right, right. I've heard other people say that life was so different then, but that going downtown, going to Neiman's or going to, you know, just downtown to go to the movies or whatever was so different. Do you remember sort of that?
I remember a couple of strange things. The Neiman's, I do remember going to Neiman's downtown, but the Neiman's where I went shopping was actually the one in Preston Center. So I'm not too sure when it opened. That would probably date, you know, when I was there. Maybe it was older than 10 or so. But downtown was an interesting thing in two respects. When we lived with my grandparents, they had help. They even had a small, really small apartment off of the garage, and one of sort of a revolving door of maids would live there. And there were all sorts of interesting stories, but some of them for whatever reason, would take me on their day off on the bus, shopping with them. And I don't remember specific experiences, but I do remember doing that. Also, when my grandparents lived on this unnamed street, they met when my mother and her sister were young, a German immigrant. And her husband, her name was Hattie, her husband's name was George. George was a baker. And Hattie took care of my mother in particular, who was 10 years younger than her sister, as a young person. And Hattie stayed with our family until her death. So when my mother had children and her sisters had children, Hattie came to our house once a week and did laundry and ironing and special stuff like that. But I can remember that Hattie would take me to the state fair. So I remember that very vividly, that and my oldest cousin Richard, who was only a couple of years younger than me, we did things like that. But yes, I can remember the department stores in downtown Dallas as being really large and luxurious. Definitely of a bit of a bygone era.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's turn to your married life. Tell me about where you lived, what you were doing, having kids.
Claremont is very definitely a college town, with the Claremont colleges being there. And primarily because of our friend John, who was a math professor there, our social group was pretty much connected to the Claremont colleges. Eventually, not so eventually, in 1970 our son Jed was born, and Jed was a pretty sharp little kid. And he went to a wonderful preschool, but when he entered first grade, I don't think it was kindergarten, I think it was first grade. He actually was a bit of a handful because he was sort of ahead of himself. So our daughter, Amanda, was born 2.5 years later. And Amanda, while certainly bright and darling and extremely verbal, was not the little brainiac that Jed was. And there was, and actually still is in Claremont, a place called Foothill Country Day School, which was well thought of. And at some point, Lee had come from a private school background, and so he approved of private schools. I had not, and therefore I didn't. But the public schools sort of recommended that Jed might do better in that kind of an environment because they started a class of 20 every year in their kindergarten. There were only 20 places, and so it was difficult to get in after that. So we actually enrolled Amanda at Foothill Country Day in kindergarten, hoping that then Jed would be a little legacy or something, and if there were an opening, he would have a chance to get into it, which is what happened. Well, certainly at Foothill Country Day School, I met a lot of the Jewish community whose children were going there. And actually, there was one family who Jed was friendly with from public school, who they were also members of the temple. And they encouraged us to join the temple, which of course we had not done previously. I wasn't wild for the rabbi, and everybody knew it. And the day that the rabbi resigned, my phone rang off the wall with my friends calling me to say, now you can join the temple, which we did, in fact, do. And we really had a large group of both Jewish and non-Jewish friends in Claremont. Both of our children were B'nai Mitzvah there. Lee, who was a convert at the time of our marriage, as is sometimes the case, was very active in the Brotherhood. He can tell fabulous stories about his female impersonations and his cooking latkes at the temple and doing a whole lot of other things. And I was very active there as well. We really had a great Jewish group of friends.
You mentioned the fact that that Lee in particular, but that most of your friends are people who were involved in civil rights movement, who were involved in, making the world a better place. Liberal causes. That's a great description. Tell me about that. Tell me about your friends and how you got, what you did and kind of how you got there.
Well, the story definitely starts with Lee, who should describe it better than I could. But when Lee came to Claremont, I really do need to let him tell you about that, because I can't even remember. I'm pretty sure he was a member of CORE, and perhaps that was how he met his friend John, and the two of them were definitely the movers and shakers in that movement. I certainly during college did not have any connection with anything like that. I was just trying to keep my head above water. And I can't say that we were members of any specific groups or movements during our married life specifically.
Okay.
He may have a much better memory.
Okay, and we'll get that from him. What's your married life like in Claremont? I mean,
good, bad,
kids?
and indifferent. No. Lee has always been an incredibly hard worker. He taught history and political science at Mount San Antonio College. And after I got out of teaching junior high school English, thank God, I did start an editing and typing service for primarily Claremont Graduate School, but also I typed photo-ready books for a number of years and things like that. So that was our fun money, and it was all in cash, and we were very fortunate to have it. Lee's teaching schedule was from 8 until about noon, and at one point he met an adult student. I mean, he was a non-traditional student who he became friendly with, and who was a semi-trailer salesperson. And because Lee can fix anything and do anything, he suggested that Lee start a trailer repair business, which Lee did. He drove an old pickup truck with a service body on it that had all of his tools in it. And he would leave Mount San Antonio and drive 20 or 30 minutes to Montebello and fix trailers and fix roll-up doors and all sorts of things like that. And I was still doing my typing and editing. And then he actually created a company that was worth selling. He had assets to sell, which he did. And he and one of the Harvey Mudd professors started a solar heating company, because Lee had the physical expertise and Bob had the computer expertise. Luckily,
what year was this?
This was probably in the middle to late 70s. 78, 79, 77. And they were wildly successful. They started out just doing consulting and computations. And as Lee would say, people started wanting them to actually do the installation. And they said, well, you have to have either a general contracting license or a plumber's license to do the installation. And the plumbing test was thought to be, for a state license, thought to be pretty arduous. But then they were able to find out that you could program like a little Hewlett-Packard handheld computer at that point. This was Bob's expertise. So they passed the plumbing license test with flying colors. and eventually we had a crew. Bob's wife, Kathleen, and I sort of took care of the behind the scenes and the books and everything. And they really had a very, very successful business. They installed solar heating at the Claremont colleges and a number of large, as well as many, many, many homes. Once again, our best friends at the time, the Sapersteins, were among many of the Jewish clients. I mean, and it was sort of a word of mouth kind of thing. Yes, I don't even know if they did really advertise, but it was very word of mouth. And we did a whole lot of home as well as commercial installations, and we have some moderately hysterical stories about some of that. But it was very successful, and Lee was able to sell his half of the business to Bob. And because about that time, the same trailer friend had become the vice president of a national trailer sales company organization that was big and very prosperous. And because of Lee's expertise, he asked us to move to the Bay Area and open a branch for them. So in 2 hours, we talked about it and decided to do that. And Lee retired from teaching college. We moved to Northern California, where our daughter attended all of high school. Our son was on a year of study abroad, so he, I think, actually came to Northern California for just a year before he went to college. But that was a very nice move for us financially. I mean, college, even with all these other side ventures, college teaching is a labor of love, not a labor of money.
Absolutely.
But the trailer business was very successful, so we were lucky.
Did you travel much during those years? I mean, it sounds like you were very busy with...
Certainly when all that we were doing was Lee's teaching, he always said, because he was a mountaineer, that he chose college as his teaching as his profession because of the great summer benefits program. So we did travel pretty much every summer, and most of those travels were camping, and most of that time we actually camped with my parents, who, God forbid, had never camped before, but we were enough of a draw to make them give it a try. And then my father always knew he would love it, but my mother discovered she loved it too. So we did that. That was actually how I first was acquainted with Santa Fe. So we did that a lot. And I think, as I mentioned, my parents first invited each of the children to visit them in Dallas when they turned 5 and could fly alone. So they did. They also asked our son Jed at a very early age where he would like to visit, and he said England. So they made that a reality, and they had a several-week trip to England. And our daughter, had the same opportunity. She chose Italy, so they traveled with her there. I was trying to think. Then I know that my dad took us all, and by all I mean my brother and his wife, the 4 of us, and Lee's mother, who had been widowed. He took all of us to England over the holidays, and we had a wonderful, wonderful time doing that. Eventually, Lee and I became interested in sailing, and we chartered a large sailboat on which 10 of us, my parents, Lee and I, our children, Alan, his wife, and her daughter, and our cousin Jacob Stein, the Steins who still live in Dallas. We all went on that sailboat for a wonderful, wonderful week. And I was trying to think of other places that we traveled. Oh, Lee fished a lot in Mexico. And so we would take fishing boats and caravan with some of our California friends and our parents to Mexico. Our parents were very, very good sports. And certainly when we were around, they would put up with anything and everything. So we had good times.
That's wonderful. Sounds like a wonderful life. So you're in San Francisco. Then what happens next?
what happens is that Lee's trailer sales operation was very small. He had 2 salespeople who worked for him and some like drivers and things like that, but 2 salespeople. And I was actually his office manager. And Lee and I have always worked together, probably even better than we've lived together. But we were doing fine. But it dawned on us that since we were sort of the heart and soul of this operation, we'd never be able to both be gone on any kind of vacation. So this long-time friend of ours, ex-student of Lee's, was on a work rotation in the San Francisco area for Pacific Bell Directory. And in fact, she lived on our sailboat. We had a small sailboat at that time. She lived up there. And she decided that I would fit in well at the phone company and lobbied her boss, a VP at the phone company, to hire me, which he really didn't want to do because I was a middle-aged woman and he was more interested in having young people. But at any rate, I did get a job at the phone company, and Lee was still running his trailer sales business. I did, because I was a middle-aged woman, I did very well at the phone company and rose through the ranks quickly. I was only there 10 years, but it was a great 10 years in terms of the retirement that I got and the medical benefits that I got. And Lee was able to start and ultimately buy from the trailer company a trailer rental company where he rented trailers for storage, and then was able to very successfully sell that company. We decided that we wanted to live on our sailboat and sail around, and the little boat that we had was too small, so we launched a search for a bigger boat, which we found in Fort Lauderdale and had brought back to California. And while I was still working at the phone company and Lee had sold his sales and rental company, he refurbished this boat into an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous boat. And in about 2001, I formally retired and we headed south on our sailboat.
How long did you live on the sailboat?
We lived on the sailboat for about 10 years. We actively cruised it in Mexico for a couple of years, and it was big enough that all of our friends did and could come and stay with us. And then we were sadly beaten up. The boat was beaten up in a hurricane, and we decided it needed to go to Fort Lauderdale for cosmetic repairs. And so we and the boat ended up in Fort Lauderdale, where in fact it was repaired beautifully. But Lee and I were getting sort of beaten up too. And so we sold that boat and bought a little condo in Fort Lauderdale and lived there for about 7 years, which was fun because Lee is an avid fisherman and he had a small fishing boat, and that was all good. I would say there was not a hint of Jewish life in Fort Lauderdale, except for his very good friend, David Goldberg, who was a fishing guide there, and we became very friendly with, and David is a practicing Jew, or semi-practicing Jew, what can we say? But anyway, and then we ended up here in...
And how did you end up here in Santa Fe?
Primarily our daughter, Amanda, who has always lived in California and was living in Southern California, visited here on her own after probably not ever remembering visiting here before. And we were living in Fort Lauderdale. My dad, who was growing older, was living in Austin, and Amanda was living in California. Our son and his family were actually in Florida, but we were sort of out of place. And Amanda said, gee, I think Santa Fe is a wonderful place. Let's buy a house, and you can live there during the hot Florida summertime, and go back to Florida for the winters. And I could use the house as a place as just a vacation spot or a place to ski from. And it's also close to my dad in Austin, so that would be a good thing. So that evolved strangely. Because Amanda and I were going to buy the house together, everybody has their foibles or their weirdnesses. Amanda's weirdness is that she doesn't want to share a bathroom with anyone. So to find a house here where there would be, a master suite and at least another bedroom on the same level for my dad, but room with its own bathroom for Amanda, we ended up in this moderately oversized house, which luckily we love. And partly because of the expense, but partly because Lee very rightly, I think, saw the handwriting on the wall that Florida was going to experience some difficult weather. And we also, Florida is Florida.
Exactly.
We decided that we would move here full time, which was a great decision.
And you've been here how long?
4 years.
4 years, and you're loving it.
Yes.
And what are you involved in now that you're here in?
Lee's still fishing in Florida wasn't super simple because to go to the best fishing you had to drive a couple of hours.
Right.
That's also true here. You have to drive a couple of hours, but Lee still is a very active fisher person. I have been fortunate that this two sisters who are very good friends have moved here, so they're an important part of our life. The community that we live in is a very friendly community, so we have made good friends who we socialize with. Lee in particular and I as a subsidiary love classical music, and Santa Fe couldn't be better for that. There's a chamber music festival every summer that we partake of. There's a lot of good music all year round. Our friends who moved here love the opera, so we've been sort of exposed to the opera. And I volunteer. My dad did, after he moved here too, volunteer at the local hospital, and I volunteer also for the School for Advanced Research, which is a very interesting, heavily academic place that supports Native American arts and also art and artists, and has a phenomenal collection. But it also supports academics of every stripe who get to come for 9 months and live there virtually expense-free in wonderful little apartments, and they get to continue with their research and discuss that research with other scholars in totally different fields. So it's a very interesting
Sounds
place.
very exciting.
I like it.
We'll take a break in just a minute, and when we come back, I'll ask you more about your parents. But let me ask you a couple of other questions, really about you. Who were your role models throughout your life, growing up?
See, I am my father's daughter. I'm not terribly introspective, so I'd have to think about that. I would say probably the most influential person in my life was my mother's mother, Amanda Hexter Levy, for whom our daughter is named. She was a very, very important influence.
What would you say you got from her? I mean, what about her?
She, in my eyes, was a great blend of being a real lady and being a very down-to-earth, occasionally slightly potty-mouthed kind of person. And I have missed the great lady part, but the potty-mouth part actually stuck with me pretty well. And being the only granddaughter, I was really close to her. And she was just a special lady. One of the things that it shows that is my dad, maybe he was never super close to his parents, but my dad called her every day of the world at 11 o'clock, every day, and would ask whether she had any dirty jokes to share, which occasionally she did. So they were really, really close. And, my mother was close to her as well. As I think I mentioned, my mother was 10 years younger than her only sister. All four of us, both of those families and the 4 children, the cousins, we lived fairly close together. And my grandmother paid for our one nice meal a week. On Sunday nights, one Sunday my mother cooked, the next Sunday my aunt cooked, and we all had dinner together. And that was when we would maybe have a roast or something like that, a nice meal. And she was pretty much, as many people would say, the glue that held the family together. Special lady.
Nice. You've done a lot of different things in your life. You've traveled, you've lived in many places, you've had sounds like wonderful experiences.
Yes.
What would you say at this point in your life that you're most proud of?
Our children, of course. Both our daughter is incredibly successful, as Lee would say. She's by far the most successful Harrell in all history. She is a very, very, very successful entertainment lawyer. And luckily, she's also a very generous and funny person. Our son, sort of surprisingly, is a phenomenal family man. His wife and two stepchildren, two stepsons, and a genetic son. His world is all about his family, and he works very, very hard with them, and he still is a really kind, giving person too. So, you have to, I think, be pretty pleased about that.
That's important. If you could leave a message for your children, your grandchildren, generations that come after, what would you say?
I'm not a very thoughtful person in that respect. I think I would say, and I think that we have managed to do it, is to be true to whatever you really believe in. I do remember when I was a manager with the phone company, and I had about 10 supervisors who worked for me. They would come to me and they would complain about some change that was being announced or coming down the pike. And I would say, we may not be able to make any difference, but we have to have our say. We have to say what we believe in and what we disapprove of. And I said, then, if it doesn't go your way, your only choice is, yes, you can quit your job, or you can go ahead and follow whatever the rules are. But you have to have your say about what you believe in. And I think that's important.
Great. All right, we're going to stop here for a moment. Today is September 4th, 2016. My name is Debra Polsky, and we are recording Lee Harrell, who's the husband of Patricia Titche Harrell, at their home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Lee is going to tell us about his family and how he became part of this Titche Harrell family. So tell me a little bit, if you know, about where your family came from. When did they come to America? Or if they were, born here, what's your background?
My family came to the United States on one side as the Talbots in Maryland in about 1600 or something along those lines. The Talbots have been our family members to this day. The Harrells came, as near as we can tell, in something in the order of the middle of the early 18th century. Harrell's an old English and Irish name. So they've been here a long time. The other side of the family are Rushes, and I guess the only person of any note is a gentleman named Benjamin Rush, who signed the Declaration of Independence and was the doctor who supplied Lewis and Clark with their medical kit for the trip. They've obviously lived in this country a long time, but my family moved to Texas in the 1840s, coming from North Carolina, Tennessee, and across that way. I was raised in Texas all my life. I went to school in Colorado at CSU and CU and then CSU, before going to California to finish my graduate work. I married a young lady there. We were married for a short period of time, and she departed from me, and it was in that interim that I called a friend of mine in Houston, a young woman whom I had known quite closely, and she said, well, you're in Claremont. There's one of my friends from school in Switzerland is there. You should call her and see if she's wants to go out. And so I did, and she said, no. I called this young woman. She said, no. I have a boyfriend, but I have a friend named Pat Titche who doesn't have anybody that she's attached to. So I called Pat, and we started going out, and my mother was very happy because Pat was from Texas, and that was a big deal. Bottom line is that Pat and I got married maybe 8 or 9 months after we'd met, and lived in Claremont, California.
And how many years did you live in Claremont?
Let's see, if I count time that I was there with somebody else, from 63 to 86. So,
When you went out to graduate school?
yes, I went to graduate school in 63, and was there minus a year or so that I was in Europe until we left Southern California and moved to Northern California.
And I understand you were a professor.
Yes, I took a job, what was a one-year appointment at this little college east of Los Angeles that was supposed to be very temporary, and it drug out to 22 years. I guess I never taught anyplace else.
And I understand at the same time that one of the reasons that job was attractive was because it gave you the summers free primarily to pursue your other passions.
I was a climber, an alpinist, and teaching had a great vacation program for people that wanted to go climbing. So Pat and I spent a good deal of our time in the summer times camping one place or another, traveling around.
What were some of your favorite places that you climbed?
Well, I suppose in some ways one of my favorite places was in Europe, where I did some interesting climbs when I went there, not with Pat. And then when we were back in the country, I did a lot of climbing around in California, Colorado, Wyoming. But probably my favorite place to climb was Yosemite. And in 1960, I did an ascent of the northwest face of Half Dome, which is the side you see from the valley. It remains one of my favorite climbs. It seems not as hard today as it was then, or so it appears. But it still is fun for me.
That's great. Is there anything that you never got to climb that you wish you had?
I never really sort of got it in my head to do the nose of El Capitan, which was the first thing. Any number of my young proteges did do it. It wasn't that it was impossible, it's just that it's such a striking piece of rock, very much like the face of Half Dome. And I made an effort to climb several climbs in Europe, which, because of weather, I didn't finish, and I'd like to go back and do those. But obviously those are now just memories.
Right. So tell me about your childhood, about your family. You grew up in Texas. Where in Texas?
I was born in Austin, grew up most of my life in Houston, also in a town called Burnett, which is about 50 miles from Austin. My family has, as I said, lived there a long time, but growing up in Houston, for the most part, and in the beginning I wanted to be a rancher, and so I cowboyed a lot, which let me to go out into West Texas a lot, things like that. But my father had grown up on a ranch and he wanted no part of it, so he regarded that as being foolishness. I come from a background in which my mother's family, the Talbots, were all Episcopalians, and in her childhood, two of her uncles were Episcopal bishops in various places, one of the United States. But unfortunately, I never met my grandfather, Jacob Andrew Bierman. He died before my parents were married, but I instinctively knew that Jake Bierman, who by all accounts was just a hell of a guy, was probably Jewish, but he lied about his background, because after all he was eloped with the niece of the Episcopal Bishop of the United States, which probably wouldn't have set very well. So I come from a varied background.
And so were you raised Episcopalian?
To whatever degree you can do that, yes, I was. But I'm not a very good believer.
Gotcha. We'll talk about that in just a second. So tell me a little bit about school. You said I think you said you went to military?
I went to CSU,
Mm-hmm.
then I went to CU, then I went back to CSU. I had not been a very good student because my father and I sadly could not agree upon whether the sun was shining or not. And but at CSU I had absolutely phenomenal professor in the history department who had been in command of the troops who had liberated Dachau.
Wow.
And
That's something.
it was a sobering experience, even though I knew a lot about it. Obviously, I learned a great deal more, and I remained completely puzzled by how anybody could be so cruel and mean. But it certainly turned my mind to the idea that why would anybody do that to anybody? And Bruce Fry was a really quite spectacular man, and I still prize the relationship.
So what prompted you then to go to California for your graduate degree?
I went to the Claremont Graduate School, and it had a good reputation in political science, which is what I was going to get my graduate degrees in. And I guess it's sad to admit that it's near several places for climbing, including Yosemite, but several places an hour or so away from there that was actually the birthplace of American really premier rock climbing, and that was the main focus for me. It was a good school, so I could have my cake and eat it too.
Right. Yeah. That's great. So you and Pat met, you went on this date, you married fairly quickly. What was your life like together as young marrieds before children came along?
We had a good time. Pat had no experience in outdoors at all. Her family probably regarded outdoors as going out and sitting in the back of the house. Certainly not climbing or hiking or mountaineering, or even for that matter, camping. I can imagine growing up since I had left Texas, as soon as I could get out, camping in the summertime in Texas doesn't strike me as something that would be particularly fun. Certainly not compared with being in Colorado or Wyoming, where it was chilly at night, things like that. We traveled around a lot. I was I played classical guitar. I've always been interested in classical music. Pat had, again, relatively little background. Her dad liked classical music, but he didn't do a lot of it. So we went places. We've always had a very sharp verbal relationship. In fact, we had a friend who I played classical guitar with who would call up about once a month and say they were starting a new group, and we'd say, we're really not interested in joining, we're not much in the way of joiners. And so finally Pat said to him, well, why do you keep asking us about this group? And he said, well, you guys obviously don't get along because you jaw at one another so sharply that you must hate one another. She said, oh, no, that's just the way we are. And we enjoyed, I think to this day, we jaw at one another and regard it as being part and parcel of just our relationship. Other people, Pat's parents, for example, did not do that, would not have done it, I don't think.
So I understand that you converted to Judaism as you were getting ready to marry Pat.
As I said, at that point, I did not know that my grandfather was Jewish, but I absolutely would have bet all the money I had that he was. When I decided that Pat and I should get married, having taken a class from Bruce Fry in German history, if they were going to come from my family, they were going to have to go through me.
Right.
And I'm not going to surrender. I'm going to die fighting. That's just the way I am. And so I figured that was fine by me. So I took instruction from Jerry. He was the rabbi of the temple, Emmanuel, just the nicest guy in all the world. And
Rabbi Klein.
Jerry Klein. Anyway, he was just a super guy. I was not completely finished with my conversion, so Jerry blessed us but didn't officiate, but didn't change anything. And the Titches were not inordinately religious, so it wasn't something that was really important. My mother liked Pat a whole lot, and she wasn't going to say anything one way or the other. She was happy to have somebody she really liked. She'd not been very fond of my first wife. From that point on, as far as I was concerned, I was a Jew.
So the kids came along.
Kids came in 70 and in 72, 73, and they had what we think, or we believe, is a pleasant childhood. They did lots of things. They had a real good relationship with Ellis and May. In fact, great. Sadly, my mother was, she just was not a good grandmother. She was too disciplinarian, and we kept telling her, look, enjoy the kids, spoil them, have a good time. Then you can send them back to us, and we'll take care of that. But throughout her life, with all of her grandchildren, all 5 of them, she could never do that. And so it was unfortunate. They had a good time. Didn't go to religious school because Pat did not like Irving Mandel, who was the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel, and was quite pointed about it. And as I think she has related, the day that Irving Mandel resigned and Earl Kaplan was appointed, the phone rang off the wall. People saying, okay, time to join up, which we did.
What, as a young family, what were the things that were most important to you?
I think, first of all, we were blessed with two kids that were bright and learned how to study, and they went to a small private, basically elementary school in Claremont, and it was with 20 kids in the class. They really got a great education. It pushed them, but it taught them solid fundamentals, and it taught them the value of an education. We never had to push that at them. So they had a great time, and I think probably our most important thing was to have fun. You know, we didn't, you know, we never really had a single problem with it, with our kids at any point. They had lots of friends and did lots of things. Jed was a baseball player. Amanda did all kinds of things, gymnastics and everything. And she liked to cook. And so every year at the little school they went to at Foothill, they'd have a craft day. Amanda would make little cheesecakes and take them and things like that. And you know, but we had a good time.
What, so you were teaching, but I know you also started several businesses.
Teaching, at least certainly in the middle 60s, was a wretched way to make a living. And if you were trying to do something for your family and have extra income, so I was complaining to a fellow who had been one of my night students who became a really good friend and fishing buddy, and he realized that I'm one of those people that can fix most anything. And he said, well, why don't you come down to my yard. He was the branch manager for a company called Strict Trailer, and I've got plenty of things to keep you busy, you know, but you have to figure out how to do it. Well, my teaching schedule finished normally at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock or something no later than that every day. So I bought an old service pickup with a service body on it, took tools out of my shop, went down there, and I would go down from 1 to 6 or 7 o'clock at night and conduct business, and and that provided more than enough income. You know, I had to work, and I developed a clientele that counted on me for things. And then a friend of mine who was a college professor at one of the other colleges in Claremont said, you know, solar heating is becoming, you know, it's really the wave of the future. And he said, we ought to probably try to do something. And he was basically a theoretician in low temperature physics, and I was sort of the engineer. So we started doing consulting and design work. There were municipalities were required to develop solar ordinances in those days, and we consulted with all kinds of them, helping them set up standards that were reasonable for having solar stuff in their communities. And we were getting people coming to us wanting us to design things, architects, because architects and engineers knew virtually nothing about this. It wasn't that they were stupid, it's just that they had no experience in it, and we had made ourselves knowledgeable. We wrote some software for design, and we were doing very well. I mean, you know, we had appropriate licenses for what we did, and then people said, well, we'd like you to build it. And we said, no can do. You either have to be a general contractor or you have to be a plumber. We went out and tried to solicit some plumbers to join with us because they had that appropriate license. We had the design licenses, and between the two of us, we could probably do that. I would say that we were markedly unsuccessful. We could not interest anybody in doing it. So we sort of started thinking about it. the plumbing, all of the building trade tests in California are pretty rigorous because California being that way. And we were reading the requirements for a plumbing license, and at the bottom of the page it says if you wish, you may use a calculator in the performance of this test. The test consists of a bunch of things, legal, business, things like that. But the hard part of the test is to plumb a 5-story building and have equal flow and equal pressure top and bottom, which means the pipes have to change diameters and everything. And think about going to a hotel, turning on the water on the 10th floor, and it comes out instantly hot. Well, if it didn't have something on there to help it do that, you could probably wait till next week to get it to do that. So we looked at one another and said, Hewlett-Packard 28Cs. It's a programmable calculator. In the old days, plumbers learned what are called frictional losses. That means the water goes around an elbow or through a T, it slows down. So it means you have to calculate that in order to be sure you've got things going right. So we just programmed all of it in, and we took the test and passed, and used to jokingly say we were the only PhD plumbing firm.
Right.
And we started a company that did that. We were more interested in doing commercial work because it's bigger and the scale is more interesting, but obviously residential work. Somehow or other we became, people at the temple knew that we were doing this, and so they immediately started getting us to do this sort of things, and we did very well at that. The problem was my partner liked to be the president, and I liked lots of black ink at the end of the month. And eventually, we had an excellent buyout agreement. We were friends, and we remained friends. And I said, Bob, you got to buy me out. So he bought me out, and almost immediately, I was visited by my friend who was in the trailer business, and he came over on a Sunday I now know he came over with purpose in mind, but we were sitting there talking, and he said, why don't you and Pat go to San Francisco and start a branch for us? By that time, he'd become the national vice president of a large trailer manufacturing company. And we talked about it for a couple of hours, and it was obviously an opportunity for me to make 2 or 3 times what I was making. And so we said, sure. I retired from the college and moved to San Francisco, and we were only moderately successful doing what the branch was supposed to do, because San Francisco is a funny place. And this company were probably the masters of building huge numbers of big trailers in fairly short order. They were the principal supplier for a bunch of companies, J.B. Hunt, Walmart, things like that. They'd take orders for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 trailers, but they could build them in a few months.
Wow.
The problem is that when they do that, there's always some trailers that are coming back as trades, and they're never really good shape. And our job was to sell them. And you could sell them in Los Angeles, but you couldn't sell them in San Francisco. And so eventually, I told my boss, that was my friend Bob Sennett, that you can fire me and send somebody else up here, but it ain't going to work. He said, I know you're right. And so they closed the branch. I took the assets of the branch in lieu of severance, which by that time I had established a company that rented trailers for storage to companies, and my clients were Genentech, Sears, the United States Navy, and so from the first day we opened the door, we were making plenty of money. And I bought the company, or did this, because I wanted my kids to have it. Amanda wasn't going to do it. She wanted to be an actress, but Jed was mechanical, and he had worked around trailers, and he had graduated from UC San Diego, so we started the company. That lasted about a year, and the largest owner of semi-trailers in the world is a company called GE Capital, TIP, and they've got 90,000 trailers someplace worldwide, and they came over and said, we'd like to buy you. And so we sold them the company, and that was that. We were out of the trailer business.
So how did you come to buy the boat and ultimately live on it for a while?
Pat had a friend whose children went to Foothill with her, and she was a travel agent. She would take trip. This is in the beginning of the period when there were big cruises. So there were a lot of companies in it, and they would give travel agents free passages. Pat could go along with her friend for $25 a day. So they took lots of trips. One of the trips they took went through the Panama Canal. And Pat came home. We had fishing boats, but we didn't have sailboats. And Pat said, I want to go through the Panama Canal on my own boat. Which frankly was quite surprising because that was not her cup of tea. I said, sure, we can do that. You know, we'll sell that boat, we'll buy a sailboat. You gotta learn how to sail, I know how to sail. And so we bought a boat, and that was about the same time that we moved from LA to San Francisco. San Francisco's a different place to sail than Southern California. Blows heavy winds. If you can sail there, sail any place. So we sailed a lot, and then it dawned on Pat one day that this boat was just 37 feet long, really wasn't big enough to have a lot of guests. We'd been at sea with another couple, but 2 people slept in the salon, 2 people slept in the one cabin, one head, and so we started looking for a boat, and ultimately found a boat in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, had it taken apart, trucked to the Bay Area, and we reassembled, and we decided at some point in there, we'd been living on the other boat, and this boat, of course, had 2 cabins, 2 heads, and we moved onto the boat, started living on the boat. We lived on the boat then off and on while I was working on it, and then we moved onto the boat full time, and it was a good experience because we spent 8 months hauled out, meaning the boat was up on stands in the boat yard, and the ladder's about 12 feet high to get to the top of it. And Pat was she was the manager of National Publishing, the Yellow Pages, and so she had to go up and down that ladder with her go-to-work clothes on every day. And so we got the boat finished. She was still working at the phone company. We'd get up, I'd take her to BART. She'd go to dinner. I'd work on the boat. In fact, we developed kind of an interesting thing because I completely reworked her galley. And I would go out about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and buy food. Mm-hmm. And I would bring it home and I would pile it in the middle of the salon table. And that was what she had to make dinner out of. And some of the things I got, I'm sure, were maybe shocking, I don't know, surprise. But it was great for her because it did, in fact, teach her what she would find in foreign countries when we were aboard the boat. And she went to stay at the phone company until 2000. She resigned in 2000. In 2001, we left San Francisco, went out the gate, and turned left. We're down in Mexico for a while, up and down through there, and we went back to San Francisco for a wedding, and a hurricane came, and it wiped out 3 marinas, sank 90 boats. We got a message while we were in San Francisco from a mechanic friend of ours who said your boat's been sunk. I said, really? I said, well, maybe. And the person that sent it was not a particularly reliable respondent. The next day I got an email from a really good friend of ours who's a retired United Airlines pilot who was there. We obviously weren't there. And he said, you must be the luckiest sons of bitches alive, because the boat's sunk all over the place, and we're sitting there, and even the electrical cord and the TV cable were still attached to the boat. We'd moved forward about, 6 or 8 feet as the dock collapsed, but we were scratched up, but we weren't damaged. I mean, we were cosmetically damaged. We got an email the next day. You can edit this out, but he said, you look like a diamond in a goat's ass. Because, I mean, there are boats around us, multiple $100,000 boats, with their noses sticking out of the water, masts sticking out of the water all over. They and some other friends of ours moved our boat out of this place down to another marina. We got back a couple days later, and it was we then transported the boat around to Fort Lauderdale because we didn't want to go back to San Diego, because that's 1,000 miles of pretty unpleasant trip. And I'd done it and I saw no reason to do it again. So we went on to Fort Lauderdale, where we got the boat fixed. Unfortunately, we also found that the boat was fixed and beautiful, but the crew was beginning to show its age. So we decided to see if we could sell the boat, and we put the boat on the market, and it sold in 1 week, and a week after that it was gone. It was that kind of boat. It was a spectacular boat.
Wow.
And now we're in Fort Lauderdale. We buy a condominium, which we've been thinking about doing because we didn't own any property or didn't own a car. We were there for 7 years. And then we moved to Santa Fe.
What's your favorite place that you've lived? Because you've lived in some pretty beautiful and interesting places.
If you're talking about on the boat, that would be in a category all by itself. We certainly enjoyed living, perhaps, La Paz probably was our favorite place that we stayed on the boat. As far as land dwellings, there's no doubt Santa Fe is the place. Both Pat and I have independently said it's a good place to die. It's wonderful, it's great.
You've clearly already made lots of friends and...
Yep. I like to fish, so I can fish here. It's a little inconvenient to go fishing, but it's not impossible. Yeah. When we lived in Florida, I had a boat and we fished, or I did. Pat couldn't care less about fishing. She likes to eat fish, but not fish.
No, not catch them. What in your life would you say that you're most proud of?
Well, I can answer that 2 ways. First of all, my climbing career was such that if you think about immortality, I'm there. Because as long as people climb mountains, I did first ascents on lots of places, which are now being repeated by people. But if you look in the guidebook, Lee Harrell is there as the first ascent. I suppose that's as close to immortality as anybody's ever going to get. It doesn't really mean the damn thing. It was fun when we did it. We did it because it was fun. I would say other than that, my family, particularly my children. I've been very lucky. My children are great, and I'm very proud of them.
Okay. When you think about, you talked about your professor, you talked a little bit about your dad. Who were the role models in your life?
I would not consider my father to be a role model, except in this respect. When Pat and I got married, I told her, because she knew my father, you know, she were married for quite a while. Let's see, we were married in 67, he died in 72. So she knew him, and she saw him, so to speak, for what he was. He was not my role model, though. I told her when we got married, there are a lot of things that were done to me I will never do to my children. I don't know how successful I was. I think Pat's more generous about that. Perhaps I'm a bit more critical of myself. My best role model was my father's favorite friend, Tuffy Smith, T.F. Smith, Executive Vice President, American General. Tuffy Smith and his wife Ruth were married forever and ever. Tuffy went to A&M for 1 semester. The market crashed while he was in school. He had to go back to East Texas to make money. With no more education than that, and just plain gumption, he became Executive Vice President of one of the largest companies in the United States. He and Ruth never had any children. They couldn't. They put 28 young men and women through college.
Wow. That's really something.
Damn right.
That's a great.
My father would not get me a job. He thought maybe he shouldn't do that or something like that, which I personally thought was absolute nonsense. But if I called Uncle Tuffy, that's what we called him, he'd call me back and say, go see Plugwise, you know, tell him I sent you. I'd go, I'd get a job. My father would see Mr. Wise, who had a small construction company in Houston, and he'd say, you know, that kid can have a job with me anytime, any place, anywhere. Made my father happy, but he never once told me. Never. You know, could not handle it. I don't know why. Haven't got a clue. I know that it didn't make me happy. So I can't say my father was that. He was a man of integrity. He was a man of capabilities. He was just not a good father, at least as I see father.
Right. So he was a model for you, what you
yeah,
did
he
not
was a
want to
model
be.
for what I did not want to be. I'm a stupid, hard-headed person, and if my father liked it from a very early age, I didn't. He wanted me to be a good student. I was clearly very smart. There's no doubt of that. But I would not do it. And it took me until I was actually in college to realize I wasn't there for him, I was there for me. I'm a slow learner. You have to hit me in the head with a brick. Once I was there, I never was off the dean's list. One semester I took 24 units and made all A's. And I got a really nice letter from the dean, and so I sent it to my father along with a thing from the registrar that showed the thing. He never said well done. He never put his arm around me, but he framed it for me on the wall. Go figure.
That strong, silent generation.
I think that's true. You know, he's the generation that came of age in the, in the late 20s and well, actually the 30s. Went through the Depression, went through the Second World War.
He just
He
got
was
the
lucky
job
he didn't
done.
have to go. He actually got drafted at one point, but they quickly figured out that they weren't going to send him off to fight because of what he was doing. And but
Because that was more important to the war.
Oh, sure.
Than,
well, I mean, he was head of this one. I didn't realize it until later. The shifts were 12 hours long, and those guys worked 6-7 days a week during the war. And it was a lot better to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, or 7 days a week than to go get shot at.
absolutely.
So, you know, he was more, and he was exceptionally good at what he did. He just never could quite. And my mother was the same way. She was much more affectionate than he was. In fact, he was completely. He was very affectionate to women, not to men. You know. But my role model was T.F. Barnett, and there are other people that I think about that are stand-up characters that I knew. Anyway.
Sounds like you've had an interesting life and a fulfilling life. You've done a number of different things. You've taught, you've bought and sold businesses, you've climbed around the world, you've sailed, all kinds of things, and now you're in the sweet spot of Santa Fe. Anything else you'd like to say? If you could leave a message for your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren, or even your own children, about life, about what's important, what would you tell them?
Well, first of all, I tell them to be true to their own characters, but to tell the truth. That's the important thing. And if you promise something, deliver. In that respect, I'm an old-time fellow. You know, if I tell you I'm going to shoot you, you got 3 choices: buy a gun, shoot me first; run away; buy a box. So, and I suppose that's the Texas background. You know. But be truthful. Be, stand up. We live in an era today where that's in short supply.
All right. Well,
Thank you very much.
Good
I'm sorry I talked too long.
No, you're fine. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we'll end here. This is part 2 of our interview with Pat Titche Harrell, and now we have her husband Lee Harrell with us as well. And one of the reasons that we're here to do this interview with the two of them is that the Dallas Jewish Historical Society was fortunate to receive the May and Ellis M. Titche Wartime Correspondence Collection. And we want to talk to both Lee and Pat about May and Ellis and more about their lives and who they were and what they were like. And so we'll begin with that. And again, today is September 3rd, 2016. I'm Debra Polsky, and we're going to begin here. So we have all these marvelous letters from May to Ellis and Ellis to May. It's really quite remarkable that they not only saved them, but devised a plan ahead of time. How do you think that happened, actually?
I feel certain that it was my mom's idea. She was both, organized and sentimental and romantic. But I also think that many people at the time did things like that. I would certainly understand my mom saving the letters in the event that my dad was killed in war. I'm more interested, naturally don't know the answer, even though we went through a lot of them with Dad in Austin, but I'm more interested in sort of how Ellis kept his.
You would think it would be so much harder.
If he moved from place to place, maybe that was complicated. I don't know, but he was young and in love, and he probably found those letters comforting to keep as well. I think it was something that was done much more then.
Yeah, for sure. Tell us about how your parents met.
They met because when Dad was stationed in San Antonio, Fort Sam Houston, it wasn't San Antonio, where is it?
When he was in basic in Austin, at Camp Swift.
Okay, I won't dispute that. Because he was in Texas and away from home, his father said, you need to go meet the family of our cousins, Henry Titche, or Henry Titche Levy was his name. And he did do that. I'm sure they were welcoming, and that was that.
So May, your mother, was the daughter of Henry Titche Levy?
That's correct. And I had forgotten, I thought earlier, I was trying to remember what his middle name was, and I forgot that it is, in fact, Titche.
And what's the difference? What was the difference in their ages?
Virtually none.
Oh, okay.
Ellis was born in March of 23, and May was born in April of 23.
Now, Ellis grew up in Memphis, right?
Correct.
And then, do you know why he decided to go to A&M?
It wasn't really school. He went to LSU, and then he enlisted,
right.
and that was where his basic training was in Texas.
Okay. And how old was he? Did he graduate from LSU?
He did not graduate from LSU.
Did he ever go back and finish?
No.
No.
Interesting.
Dad was not a dedicated student. Mother graduated from UT.
Okay. So they meet while he's already in the service.
That's correct.
And they decide to get married. And
we have some cool letters. I have to dig those out, or maybe Alan has them. When Ellis asked his father to get a ring in Memphis, and I guess his father, maybe had a connection. They had lived there a long time, and that's where the ring came from.
do you have a sense that both families were excited about it, that this was a connection?
That's really interesting. This is background information. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with anything except for the fact my grandfather was sort of profoundly deaf, Ellis's father. And I don't know how long he had been deaf. Deafness definitely runs in our family. My dad was petrified when our son was born to check his hearing right away. There's a funny story connected to that. But at any rate, so that he wore a hearing aid, and had this great big huge battery in a shirt pocket. And his speech was, I would say, 90 to 95% normal. So I believe that he lost his hearing at some later time of his life. But he was the warmer of the two. My grandmother, Eva, was she was a housewife par excellence, and yet she was not, to us who were the visitors in the house, incredibly warm. And the story is that when Dad said he had proposed, or that they were going to get married, my grandmother, who I called Mom, said, well, if she suits you, she suits me. So my mother was pretty offended and perhaps hurt by that. We certainly traveled back and forth. They did visit us, always looking like an Okie, bringing chickens and butter and fig trees and all sorts of crazy things when they traveled, usually by train to Dallas. And we went up there. Once again, Dad's sister Eileen, who's 3 years younger than Dad.
Correct.
Their children, who grew up in Memphis, I'd say would describe them very, 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 very differently. They worshipped them. They were a really close family. My cousin Leslie is a real sentimentalist, and anything that was in that house, he loved. My cousin Sharon lives in the house that my dad grew up in. They bought that from the estate after my grandfather died, and they're completely devoted to them. In fact, my grandmother's name was Eva, grandfather's name was Claude, and Sharon's daughter is named Eva Kate. I mean, so they're super, super close. Now, having said that, our side of the family, in the Dallas side, was equally close to Ellis and May, to the extent that when Chuck's oldest daughter had her second child this February, not too long after Dad died, they named her Ellis.
Oh,
so
wow.
that was, they were really close to my parents.
It's lovely.
They had not had a father, the two boys.
Yes,
He died very early, so Ellis became a surrogate father.
right.
Oh, okay. So they met, they married. He
went to war and he came back to settle in Texas, in Dallas.
Mhm.
As I mentioned, they lived with my grandparents for the first 6 or 7 years of their marriage until my brother was born. My dad, who didn't have a degree, opened a chemical supply company which provided cleaning chemicals to commercial outlets.
right.
And I'm not too sure how many years he did that. It was never wildly successful. And then as far as I know, the very next job he had was with Traders and General Insurance Company based in Dallas. And actually, at least one, no, I think I'm mixing stories. So at any rate, and I mentioned that he worked there for many years until it was bought by Equitable.
Okay.
My mother never worked outside the house until I left for college, and that was sort of a little devastating for her. We were really close, got along really well, and at that point she became a bookkeeper for Al Barbie's florist in North Dallas, and she worked pretty much from home. She did all of their billing.
So tell me your impression from having known them as a married couple. Certainly as their daughter and son-in-law, you get a different view than their friends might have had. But what brought them together, do you think? What is it that they saw in each other?
Whatever I say is you don't really know. I know that my dad thought my mom was attractive, and I know he loved her legs. My mother didn't consider herself very attractive, and she was very insecure and I think somewhat shy. And so his attention was a wonderful, wonderful thing to her. And I understand that. It's sort of a matter of time and place. Dad was certainly funny, but I can't say exactly what kind of magnetism there was. Lee mentioned earlier that Mother was a point of stability that sometimes I think my father really needed. And I will also say that my dad absolutely adored my mother's parents. He was much closer to them than he was to his own parents.
He repeatedly said that he married May because of her.
That's true. That's right. He did say that. And my
He
grandmother
really,
was swell.
I don't think he ever had much of a relationship, certainly not the kind of open relationship that Ellis was known for with his own parents. They were very stodgy, I guess is the way to put it.
They came from Germany, their family,
My
right?
family did.
Yeah, so.
But our family did pretty much also.
Yeah, but you were a little closer to France.
That's
I
right.
think.
That must have added a little spice.
might have made a little bit of a difference. So they tell each other in these letters so many things. Did your dad ever talk about his experience in the war?
Not until, I think, which totally common to many men in war in general and World War II in particular, maybe one, but World War II in particular. Not a whole lot. Not until he wrote his little memoirs, you know, and that he was probably in his 80s when he did that. But in about, what was it, Lee, about 1989, he did sort of go, we went to Europe, all of us except Lee, who was managing a company and couldn't leave us at that time. But our two children, my brother, who at that point was not married, and my parents went to Germany. And Dad was definitely reliving the places that he was stationed in Germany. And Dad, as a clerk, is that what you would call him?
Yeah.
I mean, he used to, he would say, my dad would say that he won the war with a typewriter because he was not in combat. But he stayed in spas, I don't want to say all over Germany, but in several gorgeous, gorgeous hotels that had been taken as places to house the soldiers.
The 15th Army was going to be the Army of Occupation. Ellis was basically the company clerk. He never carried a rifle into combat. The closest he came to it was when the bulge broke out. They rounded up anybody that could walk and frost a mirror, handed them a rifle and headed them on foot toward the front. But Patton's people got there before and they were necessary, so they just turned around and sent them back. He spent quite some time in Leopold of the Belgians' castle. That was the headquarters company for Patton, who was going to be the head of when the war was finished, because everybody knew the war was done, just a question of finishing it off. So he really didn't ever have, the war for him was a marvelous experience. It wasn't like men who were in a foxhole getting shot at and seeing people get killed.
Yeah, it was actually a good experience for him, I would say.
Interesting. It's very interesting. It seems like your mother, in the few letters that I've read, and certainly they've read more, Debbie and Alexis have read more, is always like keeping his spirits up or cheering him on or that kind of thing. And we wondered if, was it being away from home and family that perhaps, or just the kind of daily grind of being a clerk and ordering and keeping details and all that kind of stuff.
I have seen a pamphlet that was instructional to young wives during World War II that gave them instruction on how to write letters to their husbands. And it was just to do that, to keep their spirits up. And my grandparent, I know that there are some letters from my grandmother and also my aunt in that collection that they sent. And they were supposed to talk about what they did on a daily basis. And I guess the expectation, I don't think there was a distinction made between combat and non-combat positions. These were people who were away from home. So I think that the instructions were generally the same without regard to the posting. So I know that that's what she did. Having said that, he had been away from home when he went to LSU, and he definitely took advantage of that. I don't know how risque you would like me to get, but I could tell some interesting stories that my father reveled in telling. Okay, if he told them, I can tell them. He went, one of the reasons, he did not have time to graduate from LSU, but that's not to say that he would have managed to graduate if he had more time. He spent way too much time in New Orleans, and in his words, he visited a whorehouse there that he was very well received at and thought of. It was on Duval. What was it? You'll think of it in a minute. He always talked about this street address of this house that he visited. Barone Street, which does still exist in New Orleans. And when we scattered his ashes last spring, that was one of the stops we made because we knew it was extremely important to him. Unfortunately, it's now the site of a Walgreens in New Orleans, and I'm sure he would be extremely disappointed, but certainly toward the end of his life, he talked a lot more. I think we all get nostalgic about all sorts of things. He went on a river cruise after my mom died. It was maybe the only trip he ever took by himself.
Correct.
And he went specifically to visit.
Well, the river cruise went up the Seine, but it started in La Havre, that's the port that he came into when he came to Normandy. Because obviously this was November, so it was months after the invasion. And of course, any cruise of that sort stops at the American cemetery, where he and another fellow were given, shall we say, first-class treatment because they were veterans.
Yes. He definitely enjoyed being known as a veteran in his later years. I mean, certainly the whole time I grew up, pretty much, other than hearing the stories of when he first met me on his return, the only other story that I heard repeatedly was, and a lot of this I heard from my mom, the ship, the Javelin, that he was crossing from England to the continent, was in fact mined and did in fact sink. That was classified information. I think there were some fatalities, not tons.
Yeah, it sank in about 15 minutes, which, it was pretty quick. This was I think it was probably just a cargo ship of some sort, and it was stacked with people. And it went down very quickly, and he went over the side and down a net into a boat and was rescued by a French frigate. He always resented that event because his buddy that was with him cut his finger going down the cargo net and went to sick bay to get a Band-Aid, and as such got a Purple Heart and got out early, and Ellis bitched about it all his life.
He got some service credit for that.
He got a cut too.
Yes.
But he said, it's no big deal, and so he didn't go, and then he was mad at himself
yes, he was
the rest
bitter.
of his life.
He was bitter about that. And what I remember hearing was that of course was classified information, and my dad was not allowed to tell my mom that had happened. But my mother figured it out because, I'm sure you'll find those letters eventually, in a series of letters, he would ask for, gee, I need a new razor, and gee, he needed all of these personal items replaced. So my mother, who was no dummy, figured out that something like that had happened.
Did she, well, of course you were a baby, but did she talk later in life as you were older about what it was like being pregnant, having a baby, him being away?
No. And I don't know whether that's because it wasn't a huge event. I don't know. I wouldn't say that my mother was reticent although there were jillions of things that we sadly never did talk about, but I'm sure it wasn't wonderful for her, but actually I suspect it wasn't that bad. She was still living with my parents and my aunt, who was actually not married at that time, and the letters revealed that they had a huge social life, of maybe just trying to be brave and busy during the war. I don't recall, yes, there were stories of rationing, especially about tires, but I don't remember them having a difficult time of it. So I think that they were moderately fortunate.
So she wasn't, so she didn't fit necessarily the stereotype of a young, soon-to-be mother on her own, kind of left behind at the army base or whatever.
I never got that sense. I mean, I know that my grandmother and maybe my aunt were with her when I was born, and I never got the fact that she felt.
The only thing they were really concerned about, to be honest with you, was because the war in Europe ended, but the war in the Pacific was still going, and all of them. Ellis said that that he was amongst them. Were scared spitless that they were going to be part of an invasion of Japan, which everybody knew was going to be very, very bloody. And course, when the bomb went off, they were amongst the first people to cheer, as you might imagine.
Right. So you said for your dad it was kind of a good experience or an event. Do you think it was more like an adventure for him?
I believe, in fact, I know that y'all have a copy of his memoir that he wrote, and I edited it, so-called edited and typed. And I think that gives you the flavor of his wartime experiences. I don't want to say, I haven't read it in a couple of years. I don't want to say there was nothing in it that talked about difficulty or privation or anything, but off the top of my head, I would say there wasn't anything like that in his experience.
Did he
even lose? Did he lose boyhood friends? I think maybe one.
There might have been
guy
some
from
people from Memphis
yeah,
that were killed,
right.
but they weren't part of his organization.
No.
He learned to fly because the Army had a lot of what amounted to Piper Cubs that they used for surveillance, and Ellis was always very friendly with people, and so as a result, he got a lot of things done or got to do a lot of things that maybe other people didn't. So he got to learn how. They took off, landed and took off on the Autobahn, and because most of the air drones had been bombed into nothingness by the war. He was sort of interested in photography, and he ended up getting a really good camera while he was there.
That's in his little memoirs.
Right, and he also pursued the daughter of the Leica manufacturer. To this day, I do not quite understand what he thought he was going to do, but he didn't care about her, I don't think, but he definitely cared about a Leica camera, which was the best camera in the world at that time.
Right. Did he keep in touch with any of the people that he served with? Was there connection after they came home?
There was some. I'm not going to remember many of them, but the quote-unquote reunion that he talked about when someone called him from across the room, was that wartime or was that
LSU.
Was it school time? All right, so yeah, that was a favorite story.
The hay titty thing. There was one man
he didn't keep up with people closely, no.
There was one man who was a photographer in the Los Angeles area, I think, for a newspaper, that when he came to visit us in Southern California, he called him a couple of times, but I don't ever recall him going in to see the guy. He just talked to him.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's right. He, for him, when the war was over, it was, I think for many men, it was just get home.
Right.
And go get on with your life.
I really don't know how many men at all served with people they grew up with. I mean, I realize that people did enlist together, and my father did enlist with at least two young guys from Memphis. But I think that you didn't really serve with childhood friends often.
Right.
So I don't know that had anything to do with anything either.
So when he came home to you and your mom, he hadn't really lived in Dallas particularly.
Not really, no.
So he was sort of coming in new, back to this wife that he hadn't spent that much time with, and a new baby. Do you have any sense about what that was like for him? Because your mother certainly had her
That's right.
her social group that she had probably known most of her life.
I believe that he fit into that quickly, easily, and seamlessly. And even though they were not avid temple members or goers, their entire crowd was of young Jewish people of their generation, people that my mother certainly had grown up with. But my father was so hale and hearty and well met. He definitely formed good friendships. My dad was always a bit more of a ladies' man, but he did have a number of male friends who he did things with.
Yeah. I think Memphis was a place for him to be away from.
I think that's true.
And Dallas was a place for him to go. And so when he came to Dallas, he sort of had a blank tablet. And I think that's what he did. And because he was so personable, and because you can go through all the pictures and everything else, and Ellis is always there in the middle, clearly part of the scene, and with a big smile on his face. And so, I mean, I think Dallas was a great place for him. And of course, he had everything going for him there.
Right. So it sounds like they had a pretty active social group.
Definitely.
And were there any particular things that they were interested in that either of them, you said they belonged to Temple for a while, but it was not, the center of their lives or anything?
I think, certainly as many young married people are, they didn't have a lot of money, and so a lot of the things they did didn't cost money. They did, and I don't remember whether this was right after they were married and before Dad was deployed, or whether this continued afterwards. There was a dude ranch in south central Texas.
No,
Kerrville?
In the hill country.
The hill country, not Kerrville, the hill country. That they absolutely, they absolutely adored that. And they, as often as they could, that was a vacation for them. And tonight you will see a heavy metal ashtray that was from that dude ranch that I use as a wine holder. It's, that was definitely a place that they really, really loved.
I think that was the big deal for them as young marrieds. That would change as kids came along.
Yes, and kids came along so quickly. That definitely made a big difference.
Were they involved? Was he involved? I mean, obviously, as a businessman, particularly once he was selling insurance, sometimes that's where men get involved in civic organizations or, brotherhood or
he wasn't
the Elks.
He wasn't selling. He was the treasurer of the company. He was, an accountant, money man kind of thing. So he never was a salesperson. He was sort of a salesperson with his chemical business that wasn't that successful. He was a member of Scottish Rite.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you to stop me when I'm wrong.
No.
And Kiwanis?
I can't say that.
Okay, I vaguely remember that, but I certainly don't remember him as a meeting goer.
Right.
I don't really remember things like that at all.
And what about your mom?
Not really. As I said, I remember she was a Girl Scout co-leader, and I know that she volunteered at our elementary school, but I don't remember her being much of a joiner either.
She was played in the mahjong group.
Actually, it became, if she played mahjong, and I'm not sure that that's true, she had a group of card-playing friends that lasted many, many, many years.
Did they play together, the two of them? Were they card players?
They did have, I did hear about poker games, and I'm pretty sure those were co-ed. You recall that? Once again, I was never at them, but they did do that.
Yeah.
Certainly as they were older, meaning when I was in high school and eventually in college, my dad, who was the techno weenie, was able to erect a somewhat unreliable television antenna so that they could receive local cowboy games. And I know that they were a big center of activity because of that, so there would be a number of people who would come over. And then definitely, probably when Leah and I were actually married, Dad was an early member of Les Amis du Vin, and that was a very eclectic group in that I think there were 4 or 5 couples. And I know that one of those couples, James and someone, Melidio, and I know they were Catholic.
Two things.
But if they were joiners, it was less humanitarian and much more social.
And what was that group about?
The Les Amis de Vin, they conducted and went to wine tastings. They became pretty devoted wine goers. I know for a fact I had never had wine growing up in my life. And in 1966, my college roommate and I spent time we traveled in the summer in Europe, and we brought back a bottle of Mateus wine. That was the first wine that I can ever remember drinking, and that sparked something, especially in my dad, who was the enthusiast, and later, my mother as well. And for a while, he was pretty knowledgeable about wines.
So you left for college, and then of course your brother left as well. And how, when you think of them as empty nesters, I guess, what does their life look like?
My dad was fortunate to take early retirement, and my mother told him, "I married you for better or worse, but not for lunch," and encouraged him, perhaps insisted that he find something to do with himself. And there was a man who was performing home inspections at the time of sale, which was not nearly as common, not nearly as common as it is today. And so he, because my dad was so mechanical and he really could fix everything, and he understood electricity and a whole bunch of stuff, they did really quite well together. My mother continued working for the florist. It was 3 years before we had children. They were very wonderful grandparents. They spent about 6 weeks with us in our house twice a year, and those were wonderful times. My children absolutely adored them, and at that point our kids were going to a little private school, and I was incredibly involved in it, and I just never considered doing anything but, I'm volunteering at the library, or I'm fixing lunch. I didn't even ask my mom, she just accompanied me. And one of my favorite things was, we lived within walking distance of a grocery store, and at one time when they were there, I asked my mom to go pick up something from the grocery store, which was super close. And like 45 minutes later, maybe more than that, she still wasn't home. And when she got back, I said, "Where the heck were you, Mom?" "Oh, well, I ran into someone I knew." So that was really what happened. Our friends in California adored them, and whenever they were there, they were invited to our friend's house for dinner, and they were really fairly beloved like that. They also began to travel quite a bit, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily cruises. And I think they also took some Perillo land tours sort of at the beginning of their travel. And they spent a fair amount of time doing that. My grandmother lived until about 1974. And as her health declined some, I'm sure that took some time. And my mother played cards. Did she volunteer at that point? I don't really remember hearing about that. My dad at one point volunteered for SCORE, which is a small businessman's
retired
organization.
executives.
Yes, right. And he did do that.
I think your mother did at one point do some work at the hospital.
At the hospital, did some hospital volunteer work. Right?
But it wasn't the focus of her attention. I mean, she did it, I think, because she thought she ought to, and she was driven by things like that. So, they lived rather simply in that respect, aside from an interest in wine and then traveling. They went camping with us, and
never on their own, ever.
What?
Never on their own.
They went camping with us,
That's
meaning
correct.
that's with us. And and Pat alluded to the fact that her mother thought that camping was going to spend the night at the Ritz.
That's not true.
Well,
I won't, I don't believe I can agree with
She had
that.
no interest in sleeping.
Today is Sunday, September 4th, 2016, and we are picking up our conversation with Lee and Patricia Titche Harrell. And we have been talking primarily about Pat's family, her parents, and we want to just finish up with that. The question I wanted to ask you was, you know them as a daughter, you know them as a son-in-law. These letters maybe give you a little bit of insight into them just as adult people, who you don't really think of as the way you think of your parents. How would you characterize who they were? What words would you use to describe your parents?
Mother, very definitely a parent and a homemaker. That was the role that I saw her fulfill. And they were certainly good friends. I mean, they did have a big circle. I call it a big circle of friends. Maybe relatively it wasn't all that big. Dad? Gee, I don't know. I mean, everybody who knew him always, just sort of described him as a hail fellow well met.
Mm-hmm.
Funny sense of humor, both in terms of humor but also peculiar. Every once in a while he would do or say something that didn't quite come off the way other people would have expected it to be humorous, and he would just sort of, say that that's my sense of humor and you have misinterpreted it. But
Right.
I don't even know. Give me some examples of how someone might characterize their parents,
Well, I think,
or as the parents as people.
I think sometimes, when you get to know your parents a little bit as you're older, you begin to see them. Some of the words other people have used is they were a great team. They always worked together.
No.
Or, this person was the disciplinarian in the family, or this is the person who was sentimental and family was more important to them than maybe the other person in the family. Any of those kinds of things.
Well, my mother was a disciplinarian in the family, and my mother was also the history keeper. Sadly, Dad and I are much more alike, and looking through old pictures and documents, it was my mom who was organized, and I think the wartime letters show a lot of that. And my father was just probably by nature not as organized, but so she was the one who both collected but also recorded a lot of family history and genealogy. Her sister, my aunt, also did some of that. I know that they would write to people who either they did know or heard of or were told about, and they collected some genealogical information.
So for both of them, at least, that idea of family history being part of.
Well, it's so interesting because my
line.
father kept, Lord knows, everything. I mean, we've got little totally disorganized bits and pieces of, he had a little stamp collection, and he had a coin collection, and he had all sorts of collections that he never really carefully pursued, but yet he kept all of those things. And he had a fair amount of family memorabilia that he kept. He had, some toys, and he had a little corner bookcase that he made. I think he was in middle school, and once again, I would have thrown this stuff away if I hadn't really, toward the end of his life, sort of said, why the hell did you keep this all these years? And he at least would tell me a little bit more about it. So he, I think, was a sentimentalist, and perhaps as a man of his generation, he didn't show it that much. But he was.
But it was important to him to hang on to things.
Yes, definitely to hang on to a lot of these things.
Interesting. Lee, you knew them for many, many years.
May was the steady rock upon which that whole thing was built. She was very sensitive, very sentimental about a lot of things, but to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure she wanted the role, but she had nobody else. Ellis would not or could not take it. It wasn't in him to do it. And so as a result, she was the person who was the steady rock and the governor, and she sometimes appeared, certainly to me, and for which I have apologized verbally any number of times, we thought she was a wet blanket. She wasn't a wet blanket. What she was doing was trying to make sure the cannon didn't go off in the wrong direction. Ellis, on the other hand, Pat used the term just a second ago, undisciplined, disorganized, and he's all of those things. That he was a loose cannon. You never knew what was going to happen. It wasn't that he was dynamic in doing it. It's just that he would abandon something and start something else. After he painted some of the paintings, including the one that's on the wall over there, he gave it up. He had apparently achieved enough of whatever it was to satisfy himself, and he went on to something else. He would not pursue things. I have only just, and it's been over a year now since he died, just finally gotten the unbelievable sum of tools and screws and everything, because I kept screws in bins that were properly labeled, so if I wanted something, I went and got it. Ellis wouldn't even look for it. He'd simply go buy another 100. And the result was we had incredible stuff, and I've made anybody that I know in this area swear they will not buy a screw or a nut or anything without first coming to consult with the Harrell hardware store, because I've got stuff coming out of my ears, stuff that I would not normally have, but now I do.
So
the thing that made Ellis interesting was, I don't know that there was really a vicious bone in his body, but he was in fact very insensitive sometimes, and he did, as Pat said, he would say things, and when somebody said, wait a minute, well, why are you saying that? He said, oh, I just meant to be funny, which was basically a way of him ducking the fact that he had either intentionally or unintentionally misspoken himself.
It's clear that their personalities, at the core were different. He was much more a person of many interests, maybe not lasting a long time, but was interested in lots of things and lots of people, and that she was a responsible, sort of responsibility at her core for the family, her mother, her children, whatever it might be, and yet they grew together.
Well, I personally, and Lee and I are radically different. And so I really, it's not so much that opposites attract, but I think that opposites balance each other. And I certainly think that Mother and Dad did a lot of that.
I certainly agree with that.
What's the best memory you have of the two of them together? Just stop and think for a minute. A moment where they're laughing or they're happy about something, or, just enjoying each other.
I think my favorite memory of them was the first time we took them camping. They had to spend an extra night in Albuquerque. May was indisposed or something, and they arrived. She had been to Neiman Marcus and bought a really gorgeous sweater because it was going to be cool and chilly. And so we stopped outside of Telluride in a campground, and she wanted to have coffee. So we made coffee, and we got ready. She'd been sitting on a log off to the side while I made coffee, and so the coffee was poured, and she got up to come over, and she drank coffee made in her coffee. And it had been packaged at 200 feet or 2,000 feet, but she was at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. And so when she broke the seal, it looked like Old Faithful going off. This huge cloud of coffee mate went in the air. Only then did we discover that when she'd been sitting on the log, there was a lot of pitch on it. She'd gotten on her pretty new sweater. Now, because it was sticky, it was it remains one of my funniest memories of her.
That and
yes.
when we would use outhouses, Mother would always approach it with an aerosol deodorizing spray can. And yet, she really, really did love camping.
She loved camping. I can see the two of them. It was actually in Gunnison, Colorado. We'd come out of the backcountry, so to speak, where we'd been camped. And this outhouse was badly in need of service. And they were approaching it side by side, each with a can of deodorant.
Oh, and then there was the time when we were camping just outside of Yellowstone at a friend's cabin, which was just an A-frame, and there was also a little, like a little carriage house, and the children were old enough that they were staying there, and the four of us were staying in the A-frame. And I guess it was Mother who discovered there was a bat in this A-frame. And I can remember both my mother and grandmother. I mean, I'm not sure I'd ever seen a bat when I was growing up or anything, but I heard tales about bats would get in your hair, and it was really a scary thing. So there was a bat in this house. A mother immediately went and put her shower cap on so that it wouldn't get in her hair. And so I know my dad had like a broom, or I think it was maybe a big push broom, because it was awkward, and they were trying to capture this bat, and Lee eventually hit it with well, I beg your pardon, disable, I probably kill this poor bat, but you eventually hit it with a tennis ball or something?
Yeah, threw a tennis ball.
Yeah, but at any rate, that was
poor bat. He was scared, and why he hadn't gone. This was a log cabin, an old log cabin, probably built maybe in the 20s or something. It was owned by a very good friend of ours who happened to be our dentist, and we would go and fish together and climb together, and oh my, this bat flew around, and I thought maybe it was going to expire.
I don't believe she ever screamed, because Mother was not a screamer, but she was in distress. So that was a bad thing.
And he was clearly coming to the rescue.
Well, yeah, he was sort of flailing with this oversized, ineffective broom.
Yeah.
But at any rate, that was really funny.
Yes, that was.
But I think one of my good memories of Mother and Dad was pretty much any time they were taking care of our children or really being with our children. Once again, I think a little bit like Lee and me, Mother was, as far as I'm concerned, reticent. And she loved, certainly her grandchildren and maybe children in general. I loved our children. I wasn't wild for children in general at all. But Mother would have the idea and Dad would implement it, because Dad was just a big child himself. I mean, he physically and mentally got on children's level. All children loved him. But yet, the ideas, the things they did, were always Mother's ideas, and they carried them out.
Those are great stories.
And Lee and I do the same thing. I mean, I've got good ideas, but I guess I'm too lazy to carry them out, and Lee will carry them out.
Ellis was rather fond of glazed donuts, so whenever the children would come, they would all get up early in the morning. May, I think, would still be in bed, and they would all climb in the car and go off to have donuts. Ellis, because he never was fat, could afford the luxury of donuts without any trouble at all. And then there was, at one point, rather considerable debate about what the children would call their grandparents.
Ah, yes.
And Ellis,
This was before Jen was born.
yeah, no.
Yes.
Well, it came to fruition. There was some debate, but Ellis said, I want to be called Grandsob.
Grand S-O-B.
Grand S-O-B.
That was a good example of his sense of humor.
You know, and ultimately they always called him Ga.
Because
And-
how hard is it to say Grand S-O-B or Grandson?
Especially when you're 3 years old. You know, my grandmother was always called Sister because she was the first of 8. And you ask a 3-year-old to say Sister and it comes out shitty, so it became City.
So what did they call May?
Mawn,
Mawn.
M-A-W-N, Mawn. Because my grandmother had always been, Amanda had always been called Ma. And so I think we sort of decided that on Mawn, more than the children say, you know, just distorting something that we said.
Okay.
They were, you know, in that respect, they were both very fond of, you know, their grandparents were, in their own way, super grandparents.
Oh, they were great.
And certainly by comparison with my mother, who sadly never could be a grandmother. I railed at her repeatedly. Excuse me. May always had, you know, great fun with the kids. Ellis had more fun.
Mother had rules, but they weren't horrible rules. I mean, they were the kind of rules that, for example, Mother was a napper. So the children knew that they were going to read for the 30 minutes that she napped. And so she definitely had rules, but she was also so thoughtful. Like that was one word you described, where she was really thoughtful. And so she made sure that the children got to eat what they wanted to eat, not what she wanted to eat, and a whole bunch of things like that. The other thing that I'm remembering about Ellis though was, I think it was Lee, who was very fond of a brand of oatmeal cookies, Mother's brand, still made
Right.
today. And probably, because this happened often, we introduced those to my dad, who really liked them too. And I don't remember, I think Dad started it. I think at that point,
I started.
I think that those cookies were not available in Dallas, and so when we visited, we would sometimes bring them. And Dad, who was balding, you know, from the get-go, started saying that those cookies made his hair fall out.
We would actually package them up and send them to him along with some thoroughly disrespectful note about
Yes.
loss of hair and things like that, which of course he and the kids would sign it in. No, he got a big bang out of that. You know, I mean, they did enjoy it. Really, it was like 3 children, and that doesn't mean Ellis any insult, because in some ways it really is that he was in fact a big child, and he had a good time with it.
Dad, I think, had, with some things, what I call a short attention span. And he was always, he was always ready for the next best thing. So let's finish with this, maybe not incredibly carefully or thoroughly, and then let's move on to the next cool thing.
Right.
So,
He was had paid attention to something for short periods of
Right.
time, and then
Things that-
something else would catch his eye or his mind, and
things that would really interest him, he, as far as I know, he never read a novel in certainly my life, maybe his life. He would read technical magazines. And
Only casually.
generally, but he at one point, briefly, he was sort of the techie of the family. He was the first of anyone in the family
First
to
person
have
with a computer.
and he read a lot to figure out how to work that. You think he was just experimental?
He would bring a book, and in those days there were
That,
several,
yes.
that was this thick, and I'm not exaggerating, and that book would sit in our house and be moved and
And
it would never be opened, and he never opened it at home. what he learned for the most part was from other people who were better than he was, and in many cases he didn't quite get it always right, and he was a fairly vocal swearer when things didn't go right, and you could hear him pretty much anywhere in the house because he would be very upset by something.
But yeah, when it didn't go right.
When it didn't go right, which sadly was not infrequent.
But growing up, I never heard any curse words other than damn and hell, ever. And primarily heard that when he was hanging wallpaper.
All right. Anything else that we've missed about your parents?
Surely.
About your lives?
Okay, something that I do want to say is that in general, I would have said that certainly mother was the caregiver and, my dad was the fun giver or whatever. But when my mother had a series of strokes, he was a really good, devoted, maybe a little bit nagging, but even so, it was definitely for mom's own good. He was a good caregiver. And during her final illness, he was a really, really good and devoted caregiver. And I was surprised and certainly give him all the credit for doing that. So that was one of his finest hours.
That's nice to hear. That's a nice memory to have.
After May died, it took him about 2 or 3 months to get over the sore back because unfortunately he would not wait until he had assistance to do something, and he would hurt himself. And but he was very attentive to May.
And having said that, and having described about moving on to the next best thing, he was introduced to Minna Parvin in Austin probably no more than 3 months after Mother's death.
It was a little longer than that, but not a lot.
Remember, he was visiting us when we were on the boat, and he kept disappearing to make phone calls, and we didn't quite get what that was all about until after the fact. So he moved on very, 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 very quickly. They didn't marry right away, but he moved to Austin, and they moved in together, all of that extremely quickly. And that was Dad moving on to the next best thing. But also, in retrospect, Dad never took care of himself. I mean, maybe in the Army, and I don't know really what that consisted of. But his mother took care of him, my mother took care of him,
Right.
Minna took care of him, and after Minna's death, he had another lady friend who took care of him. So,
Not atypical for his
probably
age group.
Probably not.
And it is statistically men remarry faster.
Yes, yes.
But again, I think that's a great example of that's kind of how he took care of himself.
Well, yeah, he was
Is
always
that
taken
he-
care of.
And once he moved here, he I don't want to say he specifically surrounded himself, but he was surrounded by a group of ladies who liked him as well.
He
Lucky for him.
at the retirement facility where he was living, he sat at a dinner table in which he was the only man.
Yes. That
All
was
the
not
rest-
atypical either.
I mean, it was, and he had a lady friend. Not, they were not near as close, but I think they were actually closer than we perceived because she would come out here for dinner, and she was an interesting lady. Although I don't think he ever much questioned what she did, or what she had done. But yeah, he was always, in that respect, kind of like a kid. He was always being looked after by some woman.
Good for him. All right. Well, thank you so much. I know we've taken so much of your time and brought back hopefully some great memories. And as we progress in this project with getting the letters digitized and being able to sort of read them in order, I'm very excited and looking forward to the picture that we're going to see of who your parents were before you were born, and how they grew together even though they were thousands of miles apart.
Yeah. Yes.
So thank you very much, and we will leave it here.